Hello everyone. So the next topic which we will be going to discuss is about the facilitated diffusion. So let's start with the first slide. What is facilitated diffusion? It is a type of diffusion. So diffusion has been divided into two parts, that is facilitated diffusion and active transport. So we will be more focused on facilitated diffusion, in which it is a type of diffusion in which the molecules move from a region of a higher concentration to a region of a lower concentration, which is assisted by a carrier. So this is what is about the facilitated diffusion. Then what is the definition of this? It is a passive movement of molecules along the concentration gradient. So it is along the concentration gradient, the passive molecules movement. It is a selective process that is, the membrane allows only selective molecules and ions to pass through it. For example, this is a diagrammatic representation of how the facilitated diffusion process works. So there are so many molecules here, but only two molecules have been passed through the membrane. So this is a selective type of diffusion, because it will only allow selective molecules. So in the next case also, and in the third case also, that has been shown that it has provided the selective molecules to pass through it. It, however, prevents other molecules from the passing through the membrane. The electric charge and pH helps in the diffusion across the membrane. So there are many parameters or factors which can affect the facilitated diffusion. It can be pH, it can be temperature, it can be electric charge, through which the diffusion process can take place. Now, these are some of the transport proteins options. It has already been depicted in the definition that it is a movement of molecules from a region of a higher concentration to a region of a lower concentration by some carriers. So there are some transport protein which act as a carrier to the facilitated diffusion. So a transport protein completely spans the membrane and allows certain molecules or ions to diffuse across the membrane. So it will allow only selective molecules to diffuse across the membrane. So the channel proteins, gated proteins, and the carrier proteins are three types of transport proteins that are involved in the facilitated diffusion. So we will be discussing all the three in detail in these slides. Now, first is the channel protein. It is also known as a transmembrane protein. So it is a type of protein that acts like a pore in the membrane that lets the water molecule or small ions pass through it very quickly. So water channels, channel proteins, example aquaporins, they allow the water to diffuse across the membrane at a very fast rate. And ion channels is also an example in which the protein allow the ions to diffuse across the membrane. Then the next is about the carrier protein. So this is a uh, figure which is depicting how the carrier protein works in the facilitated diffusion part. So what is happening is, transport protein that is very specific for an ion molecule or group of substances, they what happens is carrier proteins carry the ions or molecules across the membrane by changing the shape after binding of an ion or a molecule. So they change their shape after binding to a molecule. So in this the shape was different, the shape was different. So they are involved in the active and the passive transport. So the carrier proteins are always involved in the active and the passive transport. So they change their shape after binding to an ion or a molecule. So these are all the carrier proteins which has been shown in the figure. The next is the gated channel proteins. So what is it about? It is the transport that opens a gate allowing a molecule to pass through the membrane. So it acts as it opens like a gate and allows some of the molecules to pass through it. So these are having a binding site which is very specific for a given molecule or a ion. So stimulus causes the gate to open or shut. So what happens is, stimulus, they cause the gate to open and shut. So stimulus maybe it can be chemical, it can be electrical signals, or temperature or mechanical force, depends on the gated ion channels. So if we take an example of gated ion channels, then it is the sodium gated ion channels of a nerve cell that are stimulated by chemical signal, and they causes them to open or allow sodium ions into the cell. So this is the example of gated ion proteins. So glucose molecules are also too big to diffuse through the plasma membrane, so they are moved across the membrane through gated ion channels. In this way, glucose diffuses very quickly across the cell membrane, which is important because the many cells depends on glucose for their energy. So many of the cells, they depend upon the glucose for their energy. So to allow the glucose molecules to diffuse quickly, they move across the gated ion channels, because it is an open and shut, uh, it has a stimulus which causes the open and shut of the channels. So how this is how glucose molecule has been used through gated ion channels to provide the energy to the cell. Then facilitated diffusion through the cell membrane. There are some channel proteins and carrier proteins which are shown. It has already been shown through the figures. Then water molecules and iron moves through channel proteins, and other ions or molecules are also carried across the cell membrane by the carrier proteins. The ions or molecules bind to the active site of a carrier protein, and the carrier protein changes shape and releases the ion or molecules on the other side of the membrane. So carrier proteins then turns into its original shape. Then ion channels, let's take an example of ion channels. That ion channels allows the formation of a concentration gradient between the extracellular fluid and the cytosol. So what happens is, ion channels, they are very specific because they allow only certain ions to pass through it to the cell membrane. So some of the ions are always open and others are gated, and others can be opened or closed. So gated ion channels can be closed or open in response to different types of stimuli, such as active stimuli, such as electrical or chemical signals. So this was about the ion channels. Then what are the factors that is affecting the facilitated diffusion? It is the temperature, it is the concentration, it is the diffusion distance, and the size of the molecules. So when the temperature increases, the movement of the molecule increases due to an increase in energy. So as the temperature will increase, there will be a increase in the movement of the molecules, and there will be an increase in the energy. So the movement of the molecules takes place from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So this is how a concentration affects the facilitated diffusion. Diffusion distance. Diffusion rate is faster through smaller distance than through the larger distance. For example, if we take the example of a gas which diffuses much faster through a thin wall than through a thick wall. So there is always a diffusion distance which affects the facilitated diffusion. Then size of the molecules. Smaller the molecules, or the smaller the molecules, it will be lighter. So it will diffuse faster than the larger molecules. So the molecule size should be small so that it can diffuse faster in case of facilitated diffusion. Then what is the importance of facilitated diffusion? Glucose is a large molecule that cannot diffuse across the cell membrane. So there are ions like sodium, potassium, and calcium which are charged, and they are repelled by the cell membrane. And amino acids and nucleic acids, they are polar, and they are too large to cross the cell membrane. So the water movement across the membrane is bulk and is difficult at times. So to facilitate these transfer of substances across the membrane, certain integral membrane proteins or the transmembrane proteins are required. They are channel proteins and carrier proteins. So here where the role of carrier proteins and channel proteins come in, when the glucose size is very large and it cannot diffuse, when the sodium and potassium and calcium ions and charged are repelled by the cell membrane, when the amino acids and nucleic acids are polar and they are too large to cross across the membrane, all, or when the water movement across the membrane in bulk is difficult at times. So in all these things, the transmembrane proteins are required, that is channel proteins and carrier proteins. So this was all about the facilitated diffusion and its types.